The night I found out my boss had been standing alone on the rooftop terrace for nearly 40 minutes. I was the only one who noticed she hadn't come back inside. That's how I'll always remember it. Not the city lights stretched across the lakefront. Not the open bar or the speeches or the small crystal awards handed out under Edison bulbs strung between outdoor heaters. What I remember is turning toward the glass doors and seeing, through the reflection, the silhouette of Constance Merrill at the far railing. Still, rigid, alone, while everyone else laughed and refilled their drinks and congratulated each other on another quarter in the books. I almost didn't go out there. My name is Eli Sutton, and 18 months ago I was sitting in my studio apartment in Logan Square with a resignation letter open on my laptop and absolutely no idea what to do next. I had grown up in a town called Shelby, Indiana, the kind of place where the most exciting thing that happens on a given weekend is a high school football game or a fender bender at the only four-way stop in town. My mom worked the front desk at a physical therapy office. My dad drove long-haul freight routes through the Midwest, sometimes gone for 2 weeks at a stretch. Neither of them had a college degree. Neither of them had ever worked in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows or ordered a lunch that cost $16. When I got the job at Merritt & Associates, a mid-size financial consulting firm headquartered in downtown Chicago, I thought I had finally crossed some invisible line. I thought I had stepped into a life that was going to be different, harder in new ways, maybe, but different in the ways that mattered. And in the beginning, I threw myself into it with everything I had. 12-hour days, weekends. Twice I fell asleep at my desk and had to set alarms on my phone to avoid missing the last train home. None of it seemed to matter to Constance Merrill. She was the CFO, and within the firm she had a reputation that preceded her by about 3 hallways. People called her the glacier behind her back, never to her face, because no one was foolish enough to try that twice. She was 53 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and had the kind of precision in financial analysis that made senior partners go quiet mid-sentence and reach for their notebooks. She had built the firm's entire risk management framework from scratch over a decade. She had steered the company through 2 recessions and 1 near-catastrophic liquidity crisis without losing a single major client. She was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. She was also the most intimidating person I had ever been in the same room with. I reported to her directly, which meant I spent the first 4 months of my job in a near-constant state of low-grade dread. Her feedback on my reports was always short and always precise, and always focused on what was wrong. An email from her at 11 o'clock at night meant I'd be awake until 2 fixing whatever she had flagged. Her silences during presentations were somehow worse than the corrections. A long pause before she spoke meant she was deciding how to explain exactly where your thinking had failed, and she wanted to make sure you understood it completely before she moved on. By month 6, I had stopped believing the difficulty was temporary and started believing it was personal. She simply didn't like me. That was the conclusion I kept circling back to. No matter how many other explanations I tried, I wasn't good enough. I wasn't the right fit. I was someone she tolerated because she had to, and she made sure I felt that in the only way she knew how, by raising the bar every time I came close to clearing it. I wrote the resignation letter on a Tuesday night in early November. It was raining. That specific Chicago rain that comes sideways and doesn't apologize for itself. The letter took me about an hour to write because I kept starting over, trying to find words that sound professional without sounding defeated. I finally landed on something honest and calm, something that blamed no one, because my dad had always told me you leave a place the same way you walk into it, with your head up. Then I did something I should not have done. I forwarded the draft to my colleague Bram Wheeler, who sat 2 desks over and had become the closest thing I had to a friend in that building. I asked him to read it and tell me if it sounded right. What I didn't know was that Bram, trying to be helpful in his own clumsy and well-meaning way, had mentioned it in passing to Constance's assistant during an unrelated conversation about quarterly filing paperwork. He hadn't shared the letter. He hadn't given details. He had just said, in the offhand way people say things they think are harmless, that Eli might be thinking about moving on. That was enough. I didn't know any of this when I put on my one good blazer and took the L downtown to the year-end recognition dinner at the Terrace at 900, a rooftop venue on Michigan Avenue with views of Lake Michigan on one side and the lit-up grid of the city on the other. The firm rented it every December, Open bar, past appetizers, a few awards for top performers, and then the slow unwinding of a year's worth of pressure in the company of people you had spent most of that year trying to impress. I was planning to submit my resignation the following Monday morning. The dinner was exactly what those dinners always are, warm in theory and slightly awkward in practice, full of small talk that meant nothing and toasts that meant less. I got a glass of sparkling water because I had never been great with alcohol in professional settings, and I didn't want to add that to the growing list of things I'd eventually regret about this job. I made my rounds, shook hands, smiled at people I recognized and nodded at people I didn't. Constance arrived at 7:15 exactly on time in a way that felt deliberate. She wore a dark charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, understated and exactly like her. She worked the room efficiently. A few minutes with the managing partners, a brief exchange with the head of client relations, a measured nod toward the associates near the bar. She looked composed. She always looked composed. But something was wrong. I couldn't have explained how I knew. It was something in the set of her jaw, the way her eyes didn't stay with whoever she was talking to, the way she excused herself from a conversation with one of the senior partners 15 minutes into the evening and walked through the glass doors to the outdoor terrace, and then never came back. I watched the clock without meaning to. 15 minutes, 25, 38. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, no one was going to be the person who went after her. That was the unspoken rule with Constance Merrill. You don't go toward the fire. I set my sparkling water down and went through the glass doors. The cold hit me immediately, that sharp, clean Chicago December cold that cuts through a blazer like it isn't even there. The terrace was empty except for Constance at the far railing, her hands wrapped around the iron bar, her back to the room and to the party and to everything on the other side of the glass. The city stretched out ahead of her, lit and enormous and completely indifferent. She didn't turn around when she heard the door open. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a speech prepared. I had a second glass of sparkling water that a passing server had pressed into my hand on my way out, and I had the vague, unexamined sense that someone should check on her. I walked over and stood beside her at the railing. I set the glass down within her reach. I didn't say anything. For a long moment, she didn't either. Then she said very quietly, "You should go back inside, Sutton." "I'm fine out here," I said. She didn't respond. Her hands were still wrapped around the railing, and I noticed, standing that close, that her knuckles had gone pale. She was holding on to something, not just the railing. I let the silence stay. My dad used to say that silence is a form of respect, that filling every quiet moment with your own words is just another way of making things about yourself. So I stood in the cold and looked out at the same view she was looking at, and I waited. After a while, she let out a slow breath that turned to mist in the December air. "The board received a formal acquisition offer this afternoon," she said, "from Carver Financial Group." I knew the name. Everyone in the industry knew the name. Carver was an aggressive private equity firm out of Dallas that had spent the past 3 years buying up mid-size consulting outfits and either folding them into its own structure or dissolving them for their client lists. The pattern was well documented and not subtle. The acquired firm's identity disappeared. The people who had spent years building it were given brief transitional roles and then quietly pushed out the door. 10 years, she said. Every framework, every process, every client relationship I've spent a decade maintaining. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her voice was controlled. She was a woman who had spent 30 years learning to keep her voice controlled. But underneath it, I could hear something I had never heard from her before. Not panic. Something quieter and more wearing than panic. Exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been strong for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to ask for help and actually expect to receive it. "I keep running the defensive scenarios," she said. "Every argument against the offer, every position we have. And I know we're not finished. I know there are options." She paused. "But tonight I can't make the math feel real. Tonight it just feels like standing at the edge of something." I didn't offer solutions. I didn't tell her it would be all right, because I didn't know if it would be, and she would have seen through that in about 4 seconds. I said the only thing I knew was true. "Then it makes sense that you'd come out here, instead of staying in there," I said. She turned and looked at me for the first time since I'd come through the door. The expression on her face was something I had not seen in 8 months of working for her. It was the look of someone who had expected to be alone and wasn't entirely sure yet whether that was a problem. "You're not afraid of me," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm a little afraid of you," I said honestly. "But you looked like you needed someone to bring you a glass of water." Something shifted in her expression, not a smile. Something smaller and more real than a smile. We stood out there for a long time after that. The city carried on below us. The dinner carried on behind the glass. And Constance Merrill, CFO of Merritt and Associates, one of the most formidable people I had ever been in the same room with, said things out loud that she had probably never said inside that building to anyone. She talked about what it costs to be the person everyone looks to when things go sideways. She talked about the specific loneliness of authority, the way it insulates you from the people around you, even when isolation is the last thing you want. She had been in leadership long enough to understand that a certain distance was necessary. But there was a version of distance that became something else entirely. Something closer to a wall, and she had been living behind that wall for longer than she wanted to say. I listened, and somewhere in the middle of listening, I said something I hadn't planned to say. I told her I had been planning to quit. She went very still. I told her about the resignation letter, about the 8 months of feeling like I was failing no matter how hard or how long I worked, about the specific way I had come to believe that she thought I was a mistake, someone the firm had hired that she wished it hadn't. She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she shook her head slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quality I hadn't heard from her before, not softer exactly, but more careful, like she was choosing words the way she chose numbers, deliberately, and with full awareness of what they cost. "I noticed your Q3 audit," she said, "the anomaly you flagged in the Delvecchio subsidiary accounts." I remembered writing it, a $2.3 million discrepancy between the reported hedge fund exposure in a subsidiary's filing and the consolidated numbers in the parent company's statement. I had flagged it in an internal memo at 10:30 on a Thursday night, half convinced I was the one who had made the error and that I was about to embarrass myself. I had checked the math 4 times before I submitted it. "I've been running that thread quietly for 6 weeks," she said. "What you found, if it leads where I think it leads, may be one of the strongest arguments this firm has against the Carver offer. Because if Carver acquires us without surfacing that exposure, they inherit a liability they can't account for. And if we handle it correctly, we can use it to demonstrate exactly why our internal controls are more sophisticated than anything they're accustomed to working with." She paused. "A memo you wrote in your 6th month here, almost as an afterthought, may turn out to be the most significant document this firm has produced all year." I looked at her. "You never said anything," I said. "The analysis wasn't complete," she said. "I don't brief people on incomplete work. A beat. I also was not sure how to tell you what I just told you without it sounding like something it wasn't. I'm not practiced at that kind of conversation." I stood there trying to absorb that. 8 months of feeling like I was invisible. 8 months of submitting work into what felt like a void, and getting back only the list of what was wrong. And she had been sitting on a 6-week analysis built on something I had flagged. And she hadn't said a word. "I've been hard on you," she said. "I'm aware of that. I don't apologize easily, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I want you to understand something." She looked at me directly, the way she looked at figures she was working to make sense of. "The people I push the hardest are the ones I believe can handle it. The ones I leave alone are the ones I've already decided aren't worth the effort." That landed somewhere I hadn't expected. I thought about 8 months of cold emails and late-night corrections, and the particular silence she kept for ideas that needed rethinking. I had read all of it as rejection every time. I had never once considered that it might be a different language for the same thing other managers communicated with praise. "You should also know," she said, and her voice shifted again. Quieter, more deliberate, the way someone sounds when they have decided to say the thing they have been circling for hours. "That I found out about your letter." My stomach dropped. She told me what had happened, what Bram had set in motion without understanding what he'd done, how her assistant had mentioned it to her that afternoon, how she had been carrying that information through the entire dinner, sitting with it while partners gave speeches, and servers passed appetizers, and the city glittered below the terrace railing. "That's the other reason I came out here," she said. "Not just the acquisition news, not just tonight being what it is." She looked out at the lake for a moment. I've been standing here trying to figure out what I could possibly say. The city hummed 40 floors below us. Through the glass behind us, someone laughed at something. The sound was muffled and distant, and felt like it was coming from a different world entirely. She turned and looked at me, and for just a moment, every layer of the role she carried in that building fell away. She was just a person standing in the December cold, trying to say something true, maybe for the first time in a very long time. "I am not good at this," she said. "I have never been good at this, but I need you to hear me, Eli." She almost never used my first name. "Don't walk away. Not from this team, not from this work, not from me." I want to be honest about what went through my mind right then, because I think the honest version of this story matters more than the clean one. My first thought was not warm. My first thought was 8 months. 8 months of feeling invisible and insufficient, and one step away from failure at all times. And now she was standing here asking me to stay because she needed something from me. Part of me wanted to name that out loud. Part of me was tired enough that the generous interpretation felt very far away. But I stood in the cold for another moment, and I thought about what I actually knew. I thought about the Q3 memo and the 6 weeks she had quietly spent running that analysis without once making it about herself or her own judgment. I thought about a woman who had spent 30 years learning to carry everything alone, standing outside in December, trying to locate the words for something she had never had to say before. I thought about the difference between excusing bad behavior and understanding what's underneath it. They aren't the same thing. They had never been the same thing. I didn't stay because I felt sorry for her. I want to be clear about that. I stayed because I saw someone trying, in her own imperfect and limited way, to do right by the people in her orbit. That's different from excusing what those 8 months had cost me. It just meant those 8 months weren't the whole story. "I'm not quitting," I said. And then, because it felt like the honest thing to add, "but things have to be different." She held my gaze for a moment, then she nodded once, the way she nodded when she had reviewed a report and found it sound. "They will be," she said. We went back inside. The dinner continued. No one asked either of us what had taken so long. The 4 months that followed were the hardest stretch of my professional life. The Carver acquisition threat was real, and the board's defensive response required the kind of sustained, intensive analysis that nobody had spare capacity for. I worked through the holidays. I worked through a flu in January that had me running at 60% for 2 weeks straight. I worked through moments of doubt that still came, because some habits take longer to unlearn than you expect even after you've decided to unlearn them. But something else happened during those months. Something quieter and more lasting than the acquisition fight. Constance changed. Not in the dramatic way that stories about transformation are sometimes told, with a clear before and a clean after that makes the change look easy or complete. She was still demanding. She still sent emails after 11 at night. She still identified every flaw with the same surgical precision, but she started doing something she hadn't done before. She started explaining the reasoning behind the corrections. She started asking questions in team meetings instead of issuing conclusions. She started telling people, occasionally and in the precise, clipped way that was still entirely her, that their work had been good. Once, in a conference room after a difficult client presentation, she said to the group of us around the table, "I've been thinking about how I've run this team. I haven't always made it easy to bring me problems. I'm working on that." Then she moved directly to the next agenda item before anyone could respond, because she was still Constance, and vulnerability had always had a timer on it. But every person in that room had heard her, and every person in that room knew it mattered. The Carver acquisition offer was formally rejected by the board in February, following a 6-week defensive review that drew on, among other factors, a detailed analysis of the Del Vecchio subsidiary exposure I had originally flagged in that late-night memo the previous summer. The specific argument that our internal audit capabilities had identified a material liability that Carver's own due diligence had completely missed was not the only reason the board voted against the acquisition, but it was reason, and Constance made sure I knew it. She didn't make a speech. She didn't send a firm-wide announcement. She stopped at my desk on the Thursday afternoon after the board's decision and set a handwritten note on my keyboard without slowing her stride. The note said 4 sentences. The math was right. The decision to stay was right. Both of those things matter, CM. I still have it in the top drawer of my desk. That was almost 2 years ago now. Merritt and Associates is still independent, still standing, and expanding into markets that would have seemed like wishful thinking during those frightening months at the start of last year. I was promoted to lead analyst in the spring, a role that comes with more responsibility and a direct seat at the table on firm-wide financial strategy. The work is still hard, Constance is still demanding, still formidable, still the most precise thinker in any room she walks into. But people in the firm know something about her now that they didn't know before, not because she told them, not because anyone made an announcement. They know it because they've watched her, month by month, learn to lead a different way. They know it because she asks for input now before she's already made up her mind. They know it because when someone on the team does something worth acknowledging, she finds a way to acknowledge it. Briefly, in her way, but she does it. People have asked me, since the story made its way around the office the way stories at small firms inevitably do, whether something more came out of that night on the terrace. Whether standing in the December cold together while the city went on below us changed things in some other direction. The honest answer is that what exists between Constance and me doesn't fit a simple category. It isn't friendship, exactly, though I think we are close to something like it now. It isn't the ordinary professional distance between a CFO and a junior analyst. What it is, I think, is the particular bond that forms between two people who have seen each other clearly in a moment that wasn't meant to be witnessed, and who both chose, afterward, to stay. I think about that terrace when things get hard. When a project is taking longer than it should, or the numbers won't cooperate, or the work is that specific kind of difficult that doesn't announce itself, it just settles on you until you notice the weight. I think about the way she gripped that railing. I think about what it costs to be the person everyone looks to, and how completely invisible that cost is to the people doing the looking. And I think about what a small thing it was, a glass of sparkling water, and the decision not to go back inside, that turned two people who were strangers in the most essential way into something neither of us had expected to find in that building. Leadership, I've come to believe, is not about standing above the people around you. It's not about never showing the seams, or making the burden look lighter than it is. It's about knowing when to step through a door into the cold and trust that the person who followed you out there isn't going to use what they find against you. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, the person who finds you at the railing in the dark is exactly the person you needed. And they stay.